Whether you're religiously minded, scientifically minded, or just a little bit superstitious, I think everybody loves a good ghost story. Well, today I don't just have a ghost story for you, but I've got a historical ghost story for you. So, I live in Norwich, which is a city in the county of Norfolk. No, not the American Norfolk, the proper one, in England. America, you've copied some of our really good old-fashioned English place names in the past. Can't fault you on that one. But you really struggle when you have to start thinking of names for yourself, don't you? Tennessee, Albuquerque, using the last letters in a game of Scrabble, are we? What's this video about again? Oh yeah. Ghosts! Okay, so I live in Norwich, in England, and as I've discussed before in my previous video, we have a ton of history. I'll leave the link to my last video below. Norwich's history dates back to over 2,000 years in the past, and for a city being around for that long, it's going to have a lot of history and a lot of ghoulish things happen. And this story definitely takes the cake. In fact, it isn't even a story because it is true. It actually did happen in the past. It's documented in the Norwich Historical Archives. The Ghost of Tombland. Okay, so I know the word Tombland already really sets the scene in this story, but the word Tombland actually comes from a Saxon-derived word which means open space, or also known as a market. So really it would be the ghost of the marketplace. Still, ghost of a marketplace still sounds pretty scary, to be honest. Saying that, putting the ghost of in front of any noun can make it sound creepy. The ghost of the coffee machine. The ghost of the wallet. And when he opened up his wallet to see what is inside, there was nothing there. During the 16th century, Tombland was a busy street in Norwich full of commotion, noise and people. Until one day, it wasn't. In 1578, a plague swept across England. Not the 14th century plague, which is in all the storybooks and all the school books. No, this was a second plague. And oh boy, was it deadly. This plague killed about 3,000 people in Norwich, and bear in mind that back in the medieval times during the 16th century, populations of cities were a fraction of what they are today, so 3,000 people suddenly missing, you'd really notice that. In fact, there were so many people dying that there just wasn't enough room in cemeteries and graveyards, and grave diggers literally couldn't even dig enough graves. So instead, they just dug big pits in churchyards and piled the bodies in. The church in Tombland has over 1,000 skeletons buried in its churchyard, and the alleyway for Tombland Alley is literally dug between those two piles. Walking through a crowded city, knowing that there are thousands of skeletons just inches away from you at all times, I don't know, that's pretty creepy to me. In fact, when I was a child, I used to walk around Tombland all the time, and I used to even walk on those mounds, having no idea what was underneath them. Now, Norwich was no stranger to the plague. In fact, the 14th century plague that I mentioned earlier killed around 6,000 people just in the city of Norwich, which was about a third of its entire population. Imagine having about a third of all your friends suddenly disappear. I'd only have 2 friends left. However, the plague in 1578 in Norwich left a spine-shuddering event with it. During periods of widespread disease in the Middle Ages, townspeople would often blockade their doors and windows by barring them up with planks, and they'd be forced to evacuate and only return when the threat of the disease was largely over. This was largely to prevent people from entering the property while the threat of disease was still ongoing. This is all well and good, and the houses of Tombland Alley were indeed blocked up, and that also included the Augustine Stewart house. Unfortunately, the owners were still inside. Because during this time, Tombland was largely cordoned off and the owners of the house were very sick, simply nobody knew they were there. It wasn't until weeks later when looters broke into the house that they discovered 3 bodies of dead people on the floor. A man, a woman, and a child. The bodies of the adult man and woman were covered in boils and had gone extremely septic. The body of the child, a young girl, had no symptoms of the plague. The body was clear and there was no boils or septicemia. She was very malnourished, and the general consensus was that she died of starvation from being locked inside the plague house and not being able to escape. Unfortunately, there's a little bit of information that gives this story a very dark turn. Upon inspecting these bodies, people found that the adult man and woman, presumably the young girl's parents, were covered in bites over their arms and legs. Not only bite marks, but entire chunks was taken out of their limbs. Rats, right? The young girl had human flesh in her teeth, and the bite marks were human. In an act of pure desperation, this young girl had actually been forced to eat her own parents just to stay alive. Imagine being in a situation so desperate and so dire that you were forced to do something like that to survive. And I remind you that this is a true story. This is historically documented, and it actually turns out to be one of the most gruesome things ever to happen in Norwich. And there has been some really gruesome things to happen in Norwich. There is a tale of people seeing a ghostly figure materialise in the alleyway. And side note, how creepy does this house look? The warped timber roof, the rickety roof tiles and the slanted windows. In fact, to this day, I still can't help but just stare at it every single time I walk past. Okay, so that's my favourite little ghost story in my hometown, Norwich. There's so many ghost stories in Norwich and around Norwich that it actually freaks me out a little bit. In fact, there's 3 other ghost stories just down the road from Tombland. There's also a really interesting ghost tour that starts in the Adam and Eve pub in Norwich, in one of the most haunted areas, and I really recommend them. I went last year and it was incredible. I've left a link in the description to their website. And hey, if you happen to visit Norwich and visit the places that I've talked about here on this channel, feel free to send me a DM on Instagram and maybe I'll come say hi. And if you liked this video and you'd like to hear other ghost stories from in and around Norwich, let me know and maybe I'll make another video. For now though, leave a like and subscribe and push the bell notification as well for more videos. I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching. Oh hell yeah! Oh hell yeah!